Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week represents the respectable face of board game media. He's written for many publications, including Vice, Ars Technica, and the BBC, but is probably best known for his regular work for The Guardian. He's also strayed away from writing about board games, tackling subjects as varied as urban development and LGBT issues. He's also the publisher of The Board Game Book, an annual guide to the best in the hobby. My guest this week is Owen Duffy. Owen, welcome to the cabin.
Hi Ben, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. So I want to start by asking how difficult was it for you to pick the games? Was it a real bind or was it super easy?
Yeah, well, it's really difficult, not least because obviously civilization has been collapsing around us as we try to pare down our collections. But I'm just really rubbish at picking favourites. The kind of 5 games that you asked me about today might be a completely different 5 games tomorrow. I'm just so terrible. I flip between favourite things.
And what criteria did you use? Was it pure utility? These are games that you love, or was there sentimental reasons behind it?
Well, there's a little bit of that. There are games in there that I've really enjoyed with my family or with particular friends. There are games that were important to me or that I really enjoyed when I was kind of really discovering the hobby. And then I've tried to have a bit of variety as well because, you don't want to have 5 games that are essentially the same that are going to last you until the present crisis comes to an end one way or another.
And I mean, how do you feel about games as artifacts? Do you like them as objects, or are you a person who sort of appreciates the mechanics and if it looks nice, it's fine, but essentially that's secondary to what the game offers?
Oh, I think the kind of visual and aesthetic and tactile appeal is a huge part of what appeals to me, certainly, about games. I love, wooden meeples, big chunky dice, riffling hands of cards, just the whole presentation of a game, I think, is a real selling point for it.
And I mean, to what degree can you separate them? Because I am one of these people who likes to pretend that, it's the gameplay that matters. It's not the production, it's not the miniatures. And yet, playing prototypes for me is an absolute bloody nightmare. I hate it. So to what degree can you separate the production from the mechanics, and are they both integral to what makes a valuable tabletop experience?
I think ideally they complement each other. I think if you look at everything from the artwork to the physical production to even things like the choice of materials used in games, whether it's whether it uses plastic miniatures or whether it uses wooden tokens. Just kind of so much of the atmosphere that's built around the table isn't just dependent on the rules, it's also dependent on these kind of lovely objects that you're kind of touching and looking at and manipulating on a board. And so I kind of feel similarly to you. If you stripped away the sort of aesthetic elements of some of my favourite games, I don't think I'd enjoy them anywhere near as much. And
how much of a sort of tragedy would it be for you, for your almost all of your collection, apart from 5 games, to be sort of immolated in the coming disaster?
Oh, I don't like to think about it. As we were saying, the significance that games have goes beyond just the physical objects. It's, you associate different events and relationships with them. There are ones that I've played with really good friends that I don't see anymore. There are ones that I really enjoyed with my kids. So it's, every one of those boxes contains much more than just cardboard and plastic. It's also full of memories.
And so you said in your notes that you started board gaming. So you'd been gaming for a while, but you started board gaming when, you had kids, and so your time was limited, and so you wanted something that you could do at home. So do board games sort of mark a particular era of your life? Do they signify your entry into adulthood or something like that?
Yeah, kind of. It was actually when our second son was on the way. We kind of sat down and realised, you know what, we are not going to be able to socialise for the next kind of year or two, and then that ended up being the next 5 or 6 years. We weren't going to be able to go out much, so we thought, let's get something that lets us bring people to us, that we can have a kind of social experience without necessarily having to leave the home or arrange childcare or things like that. But the interesting thing is, I've spoken to a couple of people recently who talk about getting into games at about the same time. The thing they bring up is the recession back in kind of 2008 and onwards, because a lot of people found themselves in a similar situation for a different reason. They couldn't afford to go out to concerts or to movies or things like that. So buying a board game and having kind of friends whose collections they kind of shared and participated in became this really kind of cost-effective way for them to maintain social activity and social connections and just have a good time with their friends.
I mean, do you think there's any mileage? We live in a very uncertain age. It seems as if the Anglo-Saxon world is collapsing around our ears at the moment. Do you think there's something reassuring about something as familiar as a board game?
Yeah, and this isn't even the premise of the show. This is like legitimately, liberal democracy is collapsing around us. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain nostalgia value for a lot of people, even if maybe they wouldn't play the games that they played as kids, they wouldn't be in a hurry to break out a Ludo set or Guess Who or Risk. I think there's a certain sort of part of that experience of sitting down with people around the table, of interacting, of having this kind of shared competition that, I think a lot of people associate it with childhood and family and friends, and I think it can be quite kind of comforting just to shut out the rest of the world and the horror show of take your pick, Trump, Brexit, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and just lose yourself in something a bit purer and simpler and easier to control and understand. I got political there, didn't I?
It's just the words Prime Minister Boris Johnson make me want to hang myself. Anyway, so I want to go back to the beginning. You said in the notes that you sent me that you started off as a Warhammer kid. So sort of what brand of Warhammer were you playing, and what was it about Warhammer that drew you in?
Yeah, well, actually, my first experience with Warhammer, with tabletop games in general, was when I was in primary school, and a friend gave me this little metal goblin, and I didn't know that it was associated with a game or anything at the time. I just thought it was this cool little kind of spiky monster dude. So I put it in my back pocket, and I took it home, forgot about it until I sat down, and managed to stab myself with what then I think would have been a lead miniature. So I probably kind of was quite lucky to not suffer any adverse effects. But, I learned that this was associated with a game, and then it was actually Warhammer 40,000 that I first got into, and I think that what appealed to me about it was the real kind of darkness of the setting and the whole sort of premise, this real kind of grim, kind of bleak, hopeless future. I don't know what that says about my personality as a child, but I got right into it, and I started collecting some armies, and I think there were a couple of things. I mean, I previously always enjoyed kind of video games that put me in control of things, so like SimCity or kind of real-time or turn-based kind of strategy things, and obviously there's a huge kind of crossover, a huge kind of similarity between the tabletop kind of battle games and the ones you would find on your computer or your console. And then I think what was really interesting was that a lot of the stuff that I subsequently got into, whether it's kind of science fiction or heavy metal or horror, actually kind of dates back to me discovering Warhammer, and particularly 40k. When Rick Priestley and his colleagues came up with this game and this setting that surrounded it, they kind of borrowed liberally from all these kind of musical and literary and film sources. And there was sort of a process of sort of reverse discovery where I would see, Mad Max or Judge Dredd or, listen to some Bolt Thrower and realize, hold on, that showed up in Warhammer 40,000. So it's really had this kind of massive continuing influence on my life ever since, even though I no longer play it.
And what armies were you drew to? Because I was playing sort of Warhammer in the late 80s, early 90s. Well, I say playing. What I did is I bought a load of models, never actually played it, and then tried to sort of paint them. But I was always drawn to the orcs because I enjoyed the irreverence of them, that they seemed to me to be a sort of... They seemed less pompous than all the rest of the factions within Warhammer 40k. The rest seem to take themselves very seriously. What were you drawn to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally get that. They were sort of like these kind of affable, ultra-violent space football hooligans, really. But no, for me, I first got into Eldar, and I couldn't really tell you what the appeal was there, other than that none of my friends were playing Eldar, and it sort of let me come in with a different army that no one else had. But eventually, I kind of settled on Chaos, and probably because, I just developed into, a bit of a metalhead and a bit of a horror fan in later years. And I think there was just something about that darkness and all the spikes and the skulls and the dark colours that really just appealed to me on a kind of fundamental gut level.
And then you went on from Warhammer into, something far more goth, and that's Vampire the Masquerade. Why was it Vampire and not D&D or Call of Cthulhu or the myriad of role-playing games out there?
Yeah, well, Vampire was the first one that I really came across. So there's this point in my life where I graduated from being someone who went to Games Workshop every weekend and played with their Warhammer stuff to realizing, hold on, there's other game shops and they have other games, and there's this whole kind of world beyond Games Workshop out there. And the first thing that really jumped off the shelf at me was the Vampire the Masquerade rulebook, because I think, again, it's this sort of dark, angsty kind of universe that they created around the game. And I picked that up and I was probably about 13, which, probably was far too young to be reading those particular books. And just again, it kind of opened my mind up to this whole possibility of kind of expressive play. It wasn't just presenting you with a world that you could play games in. It was one that you could kind of interact with and shape. And I loved the idea of being the GM, the storyteller. And because I was hanging around with a bunch of kind of goth and metalhead and punk kids at the time, there was sort of a natural kind of group for me to say, hey, check out this game. What do you think? Should we play this on Friday? And I did try D&D at quite a young age. The thing for me was that I think I kind of was introduced to it in the wrong group, because I had this idea that this was this really kind of improv freeform activity where you'd inhabit this character and you'd sort of make your mark on this living game world and have the opportunity to shape the plot and the environment around what you wanted to do. And the other folks in the group were a bit more like, so if I stab this guy, then I get 4 XP, and then I'll take his gold, and then I'll buy this item. And then, they were the sort of tactically minded min-maxers, which is a perfectly valid way to play, don't get me wrong, but it's just not what I was looking for. Vampire let me just sort of explore in a more kind of theatrical way, which was interesting to me at the time.
And how do you feel about the recent controversy that they were courting neo-Nazis in the latest edition? Because I read the article that started all the furore about this, and it's truly one of the worst written things I think I've ever read. Do you think there is something transgressive about Vampire that could appeal to certain people with extreme tastes?
Yeah, very probably. Particularly if you look at some of the kind of Sabat books from the previous editions. There are character traits in there which are kind of full of intolerance and hatred and nastiness. But I think there's a line to be drawn between obviously portraying those things as existing in a game's world and condoning or turning a blind eye to them. The kind of thing that was controversial recently was the depiction of kind of violence against LGBT communities in Chechnya, which is, obviously this is a game that's set in sort of a dark mirror image of our own world. So I can see why they would want to incorporate real world events into the sort of timeline of the game. But I think that it just seems like a colossal error of judgment to feature, events that have seen people persecuted and killed in real life, and to bring it into this what's essentially an entertainment property.
You're currently a journalist, but you entered into it by a rather circuitous route. So you started off being a band promoter. What kind of bands were you putting on?
Yeah, well, it started out when I was about 17, and a bunch of my friends were in bands, and some of them were finding it difficult to get bookings in places. So eventually I just started kind of hiring some really cheap, really dingy, and I say that with the utmost respect, because I love a dingy kind of, scruffy looking concert venue. So I put some of my friends' bands on, and eventually those shows started getting a little bit bigger, worked with some bigger local bands, and then eventually started putting on shows for folks who were touring and visiting Glasgow. Probably the biggest ones would have been folks like the Norwegian band Mayhem, who are kind of extreme metal.
Did you put on Mayhem when Death was singing for them, or Dead was singing for them, or was that post Dead?
No, this was post Dead. This was quite a while afterwards. This was with Attila Kazar and kind of other lovely guys, by the way, for all their kind of chaos and infamy that follows them around. They were a pleasure to work with. I put on Sabaton as well, who I don't know if you know them. They are from Sweden, and they are just the most kind of cheesy Eurovision metal band you can possibly imagine. From one extreme to the other. And yeah, it was just, it was as much about me wanting to just kind of have cool stuff going on in my home city on the metal scene as kind of any desire to make money, because, I really didn't make very much money at it. Certainly wouldn't have been a viable career, but, learned a lot from the process. Glad I did it and had some good nights, so...
And so if anyone was metal curious listening to this now, who would you recommend that they listen to? Something that could be a gateway into metal.
Okay, well, it really depends. I mean, there's such a variety of styles out there. I mean, it gets, frankly, bewildering when you start hearing about death metal and black metal and thrash metal and grindcore and power metal. If your tastes are more to the sort of kind of heavy bluesy side of things, I'd recommend maybe checking out Black Sabbath, who are kind of credited as being the originators of metal. I personally prefer their work with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, which is a bit
blows my mind. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life, but carry on.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, if you want to start a fight in a metal bar, that's a good way to go about it. But yeah, I mean, my kind of all-time favourite band is Judas Priest, who are they're from Birmingham. They're still going after. I think they're actually. It's kind of ridiculous. They've had plenty of lineup changes, so it's not the same band essentially. But I think they're coming up for their 50th anniversary at this point, which is just kind of mind-blowing. But if you listen to some of their tracks, like Painkiller, which is this really kind of heavy, aggressive, action-packed song with kind of sci-fi themes and this kind of soaring falsetto vocal, which is their singer Rob Halford's kind of trademark. That's a fantastic song. And if you want to get into some of the heavier stuff, I mean, it really, again, it depends. There's variety out there. You could look into something like Napalm Death, who are a British grindcore band, and they're very kind of anarchic and chaotic in their sound and very kind of political in their vocals. If you wanted something a bit thrashier, then you could maybe check out some classic Metallica, or there's a band, Divine Chaos, that I've been enjoying quite a lot recently. So yeah, just dive in there, get on Spotify, listen to as much stuff as you can, and see if you like any of it.
Yeah, for me, for all that he's a dreadful murderer, I think Burzum is absolutely astonishing stuff.
I have never been able to look past the guy's politics and his what he's done.
Yeah, he's a dreadful human being, but Christ, that first Burzum album is amazing. Anyway, so off the metal. So From there, you went into journalism. So how does someone without any training who is a metal promoter get into being a journalist?
Kind of accidentally, really. After 2008 and the credit crunch, a lot of bands stopped playing Glasgow. If they played a UK date at all, they did London, and then they moved on to mainland Europe. So suddenly that wasn't really an option anymore. At the time, the BBC was advertising a training course for people who, didn't have a traditional journalism background, didn't have kind of the typical academic background that gets you into journalism. So I applied for that and got into the course. And from there, that led to some work for BBC Radio, which is a great place to learn because if you're writing for radio, you'll learn a very kind of conversational writing style. And then from there, I applied for a job at The Guardian, got that, and they didn't mind me doing some freelance stuff elsewhere. So I got to just really kind of learn on the job, just find my way through trial and error and hopefully not too much error.
And so you got a job with The Guardian. What sort of stuff were you doing there? I assume it wasn't games straight away, right?
No, it wasn't. I actually started out as a community moderator. So any comments or kind of user-generated content, we had a small team and we had to look it over, make sure that it didn't have anything that would be kind of grossly offensive or abusive, and critically nothing that anyone would sue us over. So, looking out for things like contempt of court or defamation. But from there, I got the opportunity to do some blogging and I started off with a little bit of music stuff. And but the sort of big break was actually quite tragic. There was a police helicopter crash in Glasgow a few years ago where this aircraft came down on a busy pub on a Friday night, and there was a lot of people were killed. But just because I was the kind of closest to the scene, they sent me along and I reported on it, and then from there it led to more reporting shifts and opportunities to do more things. It just kind of spiraled from there, really.
And so was it always your desire to write about games, or was this just a coincidence? Something came up and you said, yeah, go on, I'll do it.
Yeah, it was really being in the right place at the right time. And by that, I mean that there weren't a lot of people in kind of mainstream publications writing about games. Folks knew that I was interested in it. I kind of told them that it was a kind of growing field, a growing hobby that had seen real kind of growth and all this interesting creative stuff happening over a period of a couple of years. So we ended up, it was actually at the time the tech editor, Jemima Kish, who was really interested. She had a meeting with me and Quentin Smith from Shut Up and Sit Down. And we just went over kind of a lot of the cool things that were happening in the hobby and in the industry. And they really got behind it. That was me for the next couple of years with that opportunity to put games into the public eye on a kind of major news platform, which obviously it's great to have an opportunity to do something you're interested in professionally and make some money from it, but it was also really cool to kind of introduce some of these games to people who might not have been aware of them before.
And so your first game then is Alhambra. And so firstly, why are you taking this one to the cabin with you?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's one of the first games that my wife and I got into when we sort of rediscovered gaming when we were expecting our youngest. I also think that as a kind of family weight Euro, it does a lot of things really well. It actually takes quite a few interesting components and puts them together in a very coherent way. So you've got this kind of luck-driven system of kind of buildings that are available for you to incorporate into your little display, and then you've got the kind of process of trying to collect these sets of cards and to use them to their kind of best advantage in different situations. But also I think there's something really valuable about the process of building your own little Alhambra design in front of you. I think that it gives people the opportunity to kind of take ownership of something. And I think that particularly for people who are new to the hobby, that idea that this is something that's mine is really quite appealing. And then obviously it's got that very Eurogame thing of indirect competition. So, you're not trying to kind of break down the other people's walls or buildings. You're just trying to do better than them with the same sort of set of resources and opportunities. And I think that is something that a lot of people really warm to, and it's something that I can teach to just about anyone. So yeah, and it goes.
And you said in your notes that you hate elitists coming down on family weight euros. Do you think this is an issue with the hobby, or does Alhambra just suffer from the fact that it's an older game now?
Well, I think there's certainly a tendency to overlook older games. I think that much of the hobby is driven by hype, and you can understand why that is, because publishers want people to buy the new stuff that they have invested a lot of time and resources and money in. But I do think that there's a tendency to sort of look down on stuff that has just become a little too popular, that's perceived as being part of the mainstream. And I think the same thing happens with, music or literature or films or anything like that, really. I think that if you look at something like Ticket to Ride, it's not going to massively challenge someone who's been playing complex strategy games for 10 years. But as something that I can pick up with my kids and, fill 45 minutes with, I think it's fantastic. It's accessible. It comes with this really kind of cheerful artwork. I think they've just nailed what it's supposed to be, who it's supposed to appeal to, and what it's supposed to do.
And so, do you think that we need a sort of an imprint like Penguin Classics for games? So we have these games that are sort of established canon, so people, when they enter the hobby, they kind of know, okay, I can try this because this will familiarise me with this scene.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting suggestion. I know that, for example, Asmodee in the UK have a line of games which they market as their modern classics. So that's things like Ticket to Ride, Splendor's in there. Trying to think what else is in their lineup, but they've got 5 or 6 games which they try to suggest as the ones that people should get into kind of off the bat when they're first getting into the hobby. And I think, just it's great to have all this new stuff coming out to get excited about, but I just kind of wish that games didn't drop off the radar after 2 weeks on Board Game Geek, I think there's something to be said for a bit of longevity and really having the opportunity to enjoy something over time and to introduce it to new people. I think it's tricky to come out with a game that has that sort of staying power. I mean, it's very difficult, and every publisher wants to have one of these kind of evergreen titles that people just keep buying and keep coming back to. But the ones that we have, I think we should treasure.
Do you think it's just an issue of the explosion of the hobby, in that there are so many games, so it's much more difficult now for a game to have that longevity unless it really captures the public imagination?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one part of it. It's so easy for things to be swamped under a tide of new releases. And I feel like, in some sense, game reviewers and critics and journalists are at least a small part of the problem there, because obviously we want to cover the stuff that's getting attention, and that tends to be newer releases. It's also difficult for publishers, some of which are quite small companies, some of which are 2 or 3 people running on enthusiasm as much as anything else, to generate a lot of kind of heat and a lot of hype around a game when they don't have a massive marketing budget. What they have is a kind of collection of enthusiastic followers on social media, and it's amazing seeing what people can do with that and that kind of sense of community, but it does make it kind of difficult to support a game in the long run.
So I want to go on now and talk about you as a gaming writer. So what I want to know is, what do you want to do with your writing about games? And I guess an extension of that is, who are you writing for? Are you writing for the neophytes, or are you writing for people who know a lot about games and preaching to the converted?
Well, that really depends on the kind of publication or the outlet or the site that I'm writing for. With The Guardian, for example, there was always an assumption that people might be coming to these games for the first time. They've never played anything since, games of Ludo in the 80s with their auntie. So from a practical standpoint, what that meant was that you couldn't assume that they would understand terms like worker placement or drafting or deck building. You had to break things down into, you had to assume that they were perfectly intelligent, but maybe not as informed as someone who is more involved in the hobby. And that also kind of guided the selection of some of the games that I ended up writing about as well. If you look at something like Tabletop Gaming Magazine, which I also write for, or kind of Ars Technica, the US tech blog that also does some really good games coverage, there you can safely assume that people know a little bit more about the hobby and kind of some of the terminology and the history around it. You can make comparisons between different games, which if people haven't played, they might at least have heard of and know, the basics of. But in terms of kind of more generally, what I'm looking to do with my games writing is to break away from the tendency, which I think exists in the hobby, to focus on kind of mechanical explanations. I mean, I was talking to a colleague of mine, another games writer, Matt Thrower, recently, and we kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of people write about games as kind of functional products. So they write about games in the same way as they might write, they might review a new camera or a new computer or a new games console. They say, well, this is how it works. This is kind of what it does. This is what it comes with. I'm much more interested in the kind of atmosphere that a game creates around the table, how it plays with different themes and ideas, how it kind of spins off ideas that have come before in other games, and who it might appeal to, and specifically why it might. What does it do well? What does it, how does it innovate on what's come before? And I think that if you look at kind of criticism in fields like film or music, I'd love to bring a little more of that approach into gaming.
I mean, I think it's super interesting. I constantly rail against this, and I think if anyone were to ask me if, for any tips on writing game reviews, I would say don't watch board game reviews. Go and read the Guardian's film section. Go and read the Observer's culture section. Learn about how people talk about books and literature, how people, talk about art. Bring that to gaming, because I'm one of the people, pretentious or not, that thinks gaming is a form of art and it should be regarded as such, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that there are people who do a fantastic job of it. Folks like Shut Up and Sit Down and, No Pun Included. They put a huge amount of not just their kind of knowledge and their ability to communicate ideas about games, but also their own character into their work. So, with those folks in particular, I think I would watch their stuff even if they weren't talking about games. It's just so kind of engaging and so well put together a lot of the time. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's this accepted format for game reviews, which tend to be, okay, here's a bit of mechanical explanation, and here's some thoughts just kind of to kind of tail off the end, whether that's in video or whether it's in text. I mean, in some cases, I can see why people might want to do that. If you want to just get an overview of how a game works, then that could be potentially quite useful to you. But I mean, to me, that approach really leaves me cold, and it doesn't really inform my decisions about what games I want to buy or what games I want to play. I mean, you do get, when these conversations come up online, you do get people who say, oh, just tell me the rules. I don't want to know any more than that. And to me, most publishers put their rule books online. So, if you've got access to that, then why would you need someone to kind of rehash that information for you?
And so, as a game writer, where would you like to see the industry go in the next 5-10 years? So what innovations would you like to see?
It's so difficult to say because you never know what's going to be kind of the hot new idea. I mean, it seems like, we had kind of deck building being a huge thing, and then we had, the roll and write boom, which we're going through at the moment. One of the things that I find really encouraging is that some kind of storytelling and kind of more RPG type ideas are coming through into the board game space. So if I think about things like Fog of Love, which my wife and I really enjoyed, or Legacy of Dragonholt, which is a sort of a choose your own adventure on steroids, where you have kind of different books that become different side quests and things like that, and just really fantastic kind of scene setting and non-player characters. I think those are just really fantastic experiences. I think that I think what is going to help the hobby grow and what's going to appeal to people who aren't already coming to tabletop games is putting narrative first and foremost in games. Because if you go to see a film or you go to buy a book, you don't really particularly care about what type of lens it was filmed with or what type of font it's printed in. You care about the plot, you care about the characters, you care about that emotional investment, and I think that's something that the industry is really starting to realise, and there's some fantastic designers who are playing with those ideas.
So your next game then is what some people, brackets not me, would consider a classic, and this is TI4. And the whole Twilight Imperium series is it's a game that holds super affection for many people, and a lot of people stand and defend this game. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I've kind of gone from one end of the hobby to the other between Alhambra and TI4, but for me, I think that it does a fantastic job of just capturing this sense of kind of grandeur that you get with kind of really ambitious space opera science fiction. You have all of these different factions, all of whom are, excel at different things, have different vulnerabilities, who want different things. But to me, I mean, TI has this reputation for being this 8-hour game with this huge rulebook and all these components and chips and tokens and plastic spaceships, and just being this massive production that just eats your table and takes a whole day to play. To me, that's slightly missing the point, because yes, it's got all of this stuff, but the real impressive thing about it is the sort of political situation that it creates around the table, the social situation that it creates between the players. For folks who don't know, Twilight Imperium is a kind of space empire building, kind of conquering game, where you're doing all the things you would normally expect to do in a game of that type. So you're building ships and you're sending them to claim planets and to fight against people and kind of conquer territory and defend it. But on every round, there is a Galactic Council phase where all of the players send their representatives to vote on laws that are going to apply to the galaxy for the next turn. And in effect, what that's doing is introducing a new rule to the game. So it might say, okay, well, nobody can have this type of technology for the next round, or nobody can take this sort of action for the next round. So it kind of introduces new restrictions and incentivizes different types of actions. And people get to vote on this, and they will vote for the laws which will help them and hinder their opponents as best they can. So you get all of this kind of bickering, and you get promises, you get threats, you get recrimination, you get all sorts of just real emotional responses out of this like fairly on the face of it dry political process. And I think that it's just fantastic. I love it.
I mean, are there any games that do it as well?
I haven't really played that many other kind of Space Empire games now that I think about it. I played Martin Wallace's game, A Handful of Stars, which is based on his kind of deck building series. I thought that it worked really quite well as a sort of strategic exercise, but it really didn't have the same sense of grandeur or interactivity between the players. I know people talk about Eclipse, which I think has a second edition that recently came out or is about to come out, as being a sort of streamlined kind of science fiction 4X game. So I'll have to give that a shot at some point. But I've never come across another game in any genre that kind of creates that sort of political rivalry and kind of nest of alliances and betrayals and backstabbing. If you look at something like the Game of Thrones game, there's an element of it as well. There's plenty of games that revolve around negotiation, but I don't think any have ever made it quite so heated or quite so consequential or frankly as fun as TI.
I mean, I'm banging a drum that I bang a lot, but Through the Ages does all of that stuff for me.
Okay, so this is my shameful admission. I have a copy of Through the Ages. I'm looking at it now. It is on my shelf, and it has sat there unplayed for about 2 years. So if anyone wants to come around to my house and play Through the Ages, I will gladly take that under consideration.
It's an absolute genius. For me, it's the best game ever made by quite some distance, and it's a beautiful work of engineering. But it seems to be a Fantasy Flight trait that they release a game, and then after a certain amount of time, they release a second edition. Sometimes RuneQuest a third edition, Twilight Imperium a fourth edition. Does it mean they just didn't get it right beforehand?
I'm not sure about not getting it right. I think that things can improve over time, and if you look at video games, people spin off successful franchises to ridiculous extents sometimes. I think that when you've invested the sort of time and the money and the creative energy into coming up with a setting and a system that people have responded to and that have, that's established a bit of a fan base, then it's pretty natural to want to try and follow up on it. And also, game design is an iterative process, and I think that you learn things from having games out there and being played, and by numbers of players that you can never get in your own playtesting process. That means that different ideas come up, different possibilities arise, things that you never considered sometimes become, apparent. So, I've got nothing against people bringing out new editions of games. I think that my understanding, I haven't played the previous Twilight Imperium games, but my understanding is that TI4 incorporates some of the material from the expansions in TI3, and that it also kind of streamlines some of the processes quite a bit. And I think there's definitely something to be said for streamlining. I think that's, mechanical elegance is something that's becoming more and more important in the hobby. If bringing out new editions gives people the opportunity to do that, then that's great. And if people enjoy the old editions, then it's not as if they're kind of, no one's going to come around to your house and take them off your shelves and burn them. I don't have a massive problem with it, to be honest.
Until, of course, Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister and we turn into an authoritarian state. So I want to go on to talk to you now about the state of board game media. So in comparison to other forms of art, board game media is, I guess, rudimentary. Do you think that the media serves the needs of the board gaming community? Is it fine as it is, in the state that it is?
Yeah, well, I don't want to kind of sound like I'm disparaging anyone's output or anyone's particular approach. I think there's something quite charming about the idea that anyone can do it. There's almost this sort of punk rock ethos. If you want to go and start a blog or start a YouTube channel, you can do it if you think you've got something kind of valuable or interesting or fun to add to the conversation. I do think that, we discussed earlier this kind of formula for a bit of rules description and a token bit of kind of evaluative discussion at the end of a piece, whether it's video or whether it's text. And I think that is, I can see why it's an easy kind of format to put together. But I think that there are enough people doing it now that we probably don't need any more. Is that fair to say?
And yeah, it is a ground up movement. Do you see, because there are people like you, there are people like Shut Up and Sit Down, that are clearly, in terms of knowledge of structure, knowledge of how to craft a review, on a different scale, professionals as opposed to enthusiastic amateurs. Do you see, as board games become more professional, as the industry becomes bigger, do you see the media heading in that direction?
Yeah, I think, if there is interest and if there's web traffic and if there's, money from subscribers to be made by providing kind of board gaming content, then I think people will make it. I think that the thing about people perhaps not having the kind of level of professionalism that others might have is that that's something you can learn over time. Certainly when I started reviewing games, I'd never reviewed anything before. I'd written straight news pieces and some features, but I wasn't really sure how to structure things and how to put points across, and that's stuff that's come over time. I'll kind of freely admit that some of my early attempts, I'm kind of embarrassed if I ever run across them now. I can see why you might think that some more kind of experienced writers would be valuable to the hobby, but I think that will come. Just give it time, give people the chance to kind of mature and develop their skills, because people are putting a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of their energy and their enthusiasm into this, and with enough time to kind of learn the craft, I think it's something that's going to improve.
And Do you think there's a future in the written medium? Because I look at someone like Matt Thrower, who you mentioned earlier, who's a fantastic writer and he writes super interesting reviews, and yet he doesn't get a tenth of the traffic that someone on YouTube would get. Where does the written medium fit within this picture?
Well, hopefully it has a future, because I'm making mostly written content. I've just launched a book, but I think that there are different audiences for different types of media and for different media platforms. I think that somebody comes to something like, say, Tabletop Gaming Magazine or Ars Technica with different expectations than they might have for a YouTube channel. And I think that as long as you have that audience, even if it might not be the biggest audience, then that's something. I'd compare it to, if you look at sort of film, how many people go out and watch films every week? We're probably talking billions around the world. How many of those people would read a magazine like Empire? Tiny percentage of that, How many people would read serious kind of film criticism? It's really about getting it to a point where there are enough people there and there is enough money in play that people can make either a living or have it as a kind of substantial kind of side gig. Because ultimately, the kind of fact is that unless people can support themselves and support their families, then you're not going to get professional criticism in any medium, because ultimately, kind of uncouth as it may be to say, professionalism means that you can make money at it.
And so moving on with money then, we were having a sort of Twitter debate. There's been a Twitter debate going on at the moment with regards to how content creators fund themselves. And at the moment, the model is sponsorship. And sometimes that's listeners or viewers, and sometimes that's people involved in the industry. And it inevitably ends up being publishers, because they're the ones who are able to provide sponsorship. Under this model, does that make impartial criticism impossible?
No, I don't think it makes it impossible. I think if you look at, again, any other field of media, advertising has been the commercial lifeblood of newspapers and magazines forever. And there are some circumstances where people have more robust editorial protections against kind of commercial interference than others. But I think that it's possible to put up a hard line between editorial and advertising. I think plenty of places do a perfectly good job of it. If I think about The Guardian, for example, one of the things that, so for your listeners who maybe aren't in the UK, over here we have a magazine called Private Eye, which is a sort of irreverent look at politics and the media. And one of the things they always took The Guardian to task for was criticising a company or a government in their editorial content, and then running ads for them. And for me, a willingness to piss off your advertisers is a great thing. So I always sort of bristled when I saw people pointing that out. I think there is a sort of danger that if people, particularly if they're running smaller review channels or blogs that rely heavily on kind of receiving preview or review copies of games, they might feel a level of pressure to kind of perhaps be kinder than they ought to games. But certainly from the publisher's side, I think most companies have an understanding that if you make something available for review, then there is the risk that someone's going to pick out flaws in it. But I think it's, you referred to the debate that's been going on Twitter, and in all honesty, it's probably not of interest to that many people outside people who are really seriously think about game reviews. People bring up points about, is it okay to do a paid preview for a game? Is it okay to, what exactly do you need to disclose? But I think that part of the sort of process of developing professionalism is that that's hopefully going to become less of an issue. Personally, I wouldn't do a paid preview for a game, but that being said, no one's kind of breaking down my door trying to get me to do it, so that's easy enough for me to say. Certainly I have been quite negative about games that I got review copies of, and the other thing is, I've got a good relationship. I know people at different publishers, at different kind of games distribution companies, and and game designers, and I've given their products negative reviews in the past, and none of them have ever kind of taken me to task for it. They always, if I see them at Essen or UK Games Expo, they say hi, and very, very occasionally people will agree that their company's game probably wasn't that good, but obviously I could never disclose those companies because they will hunt me down and murder me.
And a lot of weapons in the gaming industry.
Yes, if someone drops one of those big box monstrosities on you from a height, that's it, just game over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So your next game then is a game, but also a way of playing a game. And this is Magic the Gathering, but it's a Magic the Gathering cube. Can you explain to those, including me, who wouldn't know what that is, what is a Magic cube?
Yeah, sure. So there are various ways to play Magic. There are constructed formats, which is where you go away and you build your deck, and you probably spend a ridiculous amount of money on secondhand cards to get the ones that you need. And you take it to your friend's house or your game store, and you play it against other people who have done the same thing and see who's the best at building that deck. Then there are limited formats, things like kind of draft formats, where you pass sets of cards around the table and pick the ones that you want to add to your deck. Or there's a sealed format where you get a restricted pool of cards. You get a certain number of cards. It might be kind of, I don't know what it would be, 60 cards or something, 60 or 70 cards. And then there's a sealed format where you get a restricted pool of cards and have to kind of build the best deck you can from those. And one of the best ways to play those limited formats is with a cube, which is where somebody kind of assembles their own collection of cards with the sort of synergies that they want to have in the game, and the combos and the strategies that they most enjoy. Put those cards all into one set, and then randomly shuffle them up and deal them out to people or draft them, and then you can kind of build the best deck that you can and play it against everyone else who's participating. And to me, the thing about Cube is that it really lets people show off their personality. It lets them kind of highlight the bits of Magic, which is a massively diverse game in terms of kind of mechanisms, and put them all into this one experience to share with their friends. The other thing is that a bunch of my friends have cubes of their own and have taken the time and spent the money to build them, and now I can sneakily get in and enjoy great games of Magic without having to spend any money, which is, if you've ever played a collectible card game, that's a real consideration.
And so, what impact do you think Magic has had on modern gaming?
Well, it's huge. Where do you start? Obviously, financially, for years, it was one of the kind of main driving forces that kept game stores open. But in terms of, the people that it brought into the hobby, who went on to kind of explore role-playing or explore board games, for people who were influenced by it in their own designs. Things like deck building, I think it was a massive debt to Magic. And I'm sure Donald Vaccarino, who is the designer of Dominion, would gladly confirm that. So many of the ideas that have come through Magic have gone on to inspire and influence other designers, and I think it's just an incredible legacy. And the fact that it's still going and still strong after all these years just shows that at its core, this kind of collectible card game system, this set of basic mechanics, can just be used in so many varieties and so many kind of permutations. And I know it's I know a lot of people who don't play CCGs kind of come down on them and come down on Magic, but I, as a casual player, just think it's wonderful.
And sort of, where does Richard Garfield stand in the pantheon of all-time designers? Is he a shoe-in for the Mount Rushmore of games?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think so. If you look, obviously he's best known for Magic, but if you look at Netrunner, I've also been enjoying Keyforge a lot recently. I think just on the strength of Magic alone, what it means to the industry in commercial terms, to players in terms of community, to kind of individuals who have sunk years of their lives into playing this game. I think the guy's influence is just immense.
So I want to talk now about your sort of latest project that seems to be sort of all-consuming for you, and this is the board game book. So what is the board game book, and why should we be interested in it?
Yeah, so the board game book is the first entry in what we hope is going to be an annual series of really nice hardback books which explore the tabletop gaming hobby. So it's myself on the first one. I'm working with Matt Thrower, Terry Latorco from Geek and Sundry, and with Richard Jansen Parks, who's a really great RPG writer. And we are kind of looking at some of the best, most interesting, innovative, exciting, fun games that have come out over the course of about a year. So the book includes kind of criticism that we've written of some of our favourite games from the course of that year. It's got some really nice studio photography as well. And then finally, what I am probably most proud of is the collection of designer interviews that we've got. And I know as someone who speaks to a lot of designers, you'll probably feel the same way as well. There's some just fascinating stories that come out from the game design process. So it's been great just looking behind the scenes and finding out kind of how some of these ideas came together, where the influences came from, and really the personalities of the designers and how they fed into their games. So yeah, it's a really nice hardback book. It's been doing pretty well for us. We funded it on Kickstarter last year. We asked for £15,000 and our backers chipped in £23,000 towards its publication. And then since it launched about a month ago, we've sold about 1,300 copies, which is just phenomenal. I mean, our print run was 2,000. We took 120 games to the 120 books to the UK Games Expo, thinking, okay, I hope we don't have to take too many of them back up the road to Glasgow when we're finished. And we sold them all in a day and a half. And just the feedback that we've had from the backers, from the people who have bought it on Amazon, from the people who've bought it at Expo has just been fantastic. I mean, it's great to just hear people reacting to something that we've worked on so hard, so positively.
And so what were the initial intentions for the book, and to what extent do you think you fulfilled them?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we first started talking about the idea, a lot of people said to us, why would anyone buy that when there's all this free gaming content available online? I think it comes back to the idea of just trying to have a degree of professionalism, just the craft of writing about games, and also to kind of combine that with stuff that people couldn't get elsewhere. So these designer interviews, one of the things that is great about this industry is that, it's as big as it's gotten over the past couple of years, it's not at the point where there are hordes of kind of PR people trying to stop you talking directly to designers. And they've just been so kind of forthcoming and so enthusiastic with their time. So it's great to just delve into their ideas and their backgrounds and to put that into the book. And I think that's something that a lot of people have really enjoyed. But also, I think it's important to kind of realize that we were trying to make a really beautiful kind of hardback book, a really nice physical object, because I think as gamers, that's something that, we appreciate. That's something that people come back to, having a shelf full of lovely looking boxes, having kind of nice components and beautiful artwork means a lot to people. And I think that having a kind of coffee table style hardback for the hobby has a real appeal for a lot of people. A lot of people really appreciate the physical element as well. I mean, at UK Games Expo, I'd say at least 20% of people, when they picked up a book, actually smelled it. Which is, I mean, you could try to sniff Board Game Geek, but I don't think it'd be quite the same experience.
And so do you think that having something analogue is fitting, that it accompanies a hobby that is sort of almost willfully, going against the digital age?
Yeah, and I think it's something that you also see in things like, the kind of resurgence of vinyl records, or I don't know if you remember a couple of Christmases ago, the hot present was instant film cameras. And I think that people are really, there's so much wonderful entertainment available on tap. But I think people really appreciate having something that lets them kind of disconnect from a screen for 5 minutes, I think that people value having something tangible, something they can hold in their hands, and just that's certainly something that we've tried to tap into and to provide something for people who want that. And just people seem to have really taken to it in a big way, which is fantastic.
And so what's the deal then? Do you see it being an annual thing, a sort of, a thing that comes out every year and sums up the previous year's world in games.
Yeah, I mean, we're calling the first one Volume 1 rather than 2019 because we want to have a bit of room to just gratuitously fudge things. So if we miss a game that we really enjoy in one year's edition, we can potentially move it forward into the next one, or if something comes out in the sort of period between finishing one book and starting the next, then we can play around with things as necessary. But I mean, it's really inspired by the British tradition of annual hardbacks. And
I was thinking of the Beano annual.
Yeah, exactly.
That I would get every Christmas, right?
And that is it. And for everyone who grew up in the UK, that's an association that they instantly get. Again, you were talking earlier about the nostalgia quality of games. I think that's something that we're trying to tap into as well. The one slight difficulty we've had is that tradition doesn't really exist in the States. So we've gone to US distributors and explained, no, this in the UK, comic books and TV shows and even sports teams have these annual books that come out, and they just don't quite get it. But yeah, certainly our Kickstarter backers in the US should be getting their copies very shortly. The last I checked, they had been loaded off the boat and were on their way to the fulfillment house. So hopefully they should be getting their copies within the next week or so. And then I think it's just going to be a word of mouth thing, I think that once people start talking about it, once we start seeing some reviews on Amazon from US readers, hopefully it's going to just grow year on year. Certainly we'll be looking to do a bigger print run next year based on the kind of experience we've had with the first one. And hopefully what we'd like is to get to the point where we're doing a print run of at least 5,000 within 5 years. It's probably a bit risky to set yourself hard targets like that, but it gives us something to try
So your next game then is not a board game. I would call it an RPG, I guess, and this is Fiasco.
Yeah.
To what degree do you think this game has changed RPGs?
Well, right, so I am not an RPG expert. I'm someone who's played quite a few over the years and enjoyed them. But I think that certainly the idea of putting the story first in RPGs and sort of almost relegating the mechanical side of things is something that I have noticed in a lot of particularly kind of indie, kind of small scale releases. And I think it's great that there's this sort of thriving scene of people making these little kind of weird, artistic, imaginative games. Fiasco was one of the earlier ones, certainly. And I think that it's, for a certain type of player, it's probably impossible to play something like Fiasco and not immediately start thinking of how you could do similar things. So yeah, I think that it definitely has influenced a lot of people who've done things subsequently, and just in terms of what it does, I think it's just fantastic. So for anyone who doesn't know, Fiasco is a GM-less RPG where you are all playing characters who make a series of terrible decisions and who darkly comic things happen to. And usually it ends up with at least half the players dead, or half the player characters dead, I should clarify, by the end of the game. Anything less than that counts as a disappointment. But it's really modelled after things like Coen Brothers films, so things like The Big Lebowski or Burn After Reading. And it just gets that sort of just pitch dark kind of just tragic humour perfectly. It creates these wonderful situations. Like the first game of Fiasco I ever played was at the UK Games Expo a couple of years ago, and we played a game where a group of very faded thespians were trying to put on a pantomime, and it ended up with the theatre on fire and mass casualties and people being arrested, and it turned out that the entire production had been funded by a psychotic Glaswegian loan shark who was looking to break some thumbs. And so I mean, if that situation appeals to you as the basis for comedy, then you'll probably enjoy Fiasco.
And do you envisage seeing the first Fiasco-inspired movie coming out at some point? Because whenever I've played it, I've thought I should go away and write that up as a screenplay. It works perfectly, right? Yeah,
I mean, that is a really interesting question. But I mean, I would be surprised if we haven't already seen Fiasco-inspired movies or TV series, because I think a lot of people working in creative fields are really if not RPG players themselves, at least kind of aware of this concept. I think that if you look at any kind of the sort of ensemble series that have character arcs spanning multiple characters, whether that's things like kind of Joss Whedon stuff, whether it's Firefly, whether it's Game of Thrones, whether it's something like The Expanse, which, The Expanse started out as an RPG session. I think that a lot of people working in TV and in movies are taking inspiration from gaming, and I'm sure that people have played Fiasco and have come across or have generated situations on the fly which made their way into screenplays. I'd love to know which ones they might be.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast called Nerd Poker, which is a group of American comics, and they play D&D. And one of the comics, he works on sort of American TV shows, and he said, Dungeons and Dragons is a game for writers, and I think that could be broadened into RPGs being games for writers, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is, as I was speaking about earlier, my first experience with D&D was with people who saw it much more as a sort of tactical exercise that were much more focused on combat and on upgrading their characters. And I don't want to criticize anyone who enjoys that style of play, but to me, the sort of scope for just what Ian Livingstone, who wrote the foreword for the book, called it was theatre on the fly. It's improv, it's creative, it's expressive, it's and I just love that aspect of role playing. It's and the other great thing about Fiasco, I suppose, is that you've got very little prep for it. Coming up with your characters and the situation that they face is part of the play process. So if you're someone like me who has kids and has deadlines and who has a group of friends who have similar situations in their lives and can't commit to weekly 4-hour play sessions, then something like Fiasco is just ideal, perfect.
So I want to talk now about the future. So what do you have coming up in the future?
Yeah, right. So in the short term, we're already looking at a second print run for the board game book, which is fantastic. I mean, I never thought we'd be at this point so early in the book's life. We're looking at getting it into other regions. We've got an Australian distributor who's interested in it. We may need to run a small additional Kickstarter campaign for the second printing, so that's likely to take up quite a lot of my time and sort of mental bandwidth. We're already playing and kind of evaluating games for the second edition, and that's quite a kind of lengthy process. Obviously, you've got to play the games, but there's also a sort of process of discussion where we have a big Google spreadsheet which all of the authors contribute to, and we note down kind of the games we've played, what we thought of them, why we think they do or don't deserve to go into certain sections of the book, and then we have a sort of discussion / debate / argument / fist fight to come up with the final lineup. So we're into that process already. We're looking at releasing the next book potentially at the UK Games Expo. We had been thinking about trying to get it out in time for the Christmas market, but the big issue there is that Essen happens at the end of October, and if we try to turn around a book between the end of October and the start of and the mid to late November, then we're going to end up in straitjackets. So yeah, that's our sort of plan for the future going forward, and I just continue to do some freelance stuff at different places, whether that's kind of Ars Technica, Tabletop Gaming. I'm talking to another couple of publications which I probably shouldn't talk about, but which you might see some stuff from me at in the future. But yeah, I'm keeping busy, and weirdly, I mean, the thing that I keep sort of thinking to myself is that when I started writing some of these little game reviews and things, I never thought that it would be in a position where it was the primary kind of source of income in my life, where it was like my job, which seems a weird thing to say about something that's, you know, such a hobby and such a big kind of enthusiasm of mine. But I guess it's just the fact that I am one of a comparatively small number of people writing about games at a time when they're becoming much bigger, and I guess I'm just in the right place at the right time, so I feel very fortunate.
And so is there a piece you've always wanted to write? Is there sort of your magnum opus that one day you're going to compose?
Oh yeah, well, I have been thinking for years about this. I would love to do something on the Nordic LARP scene. And if people aren't familiar with those terms, so LARP stands for live action roleplay, which is like, you might think of your games of Dungeons and Dragons or Vampire the Masquerade, except that rather than sitting around a table and rolling dice and working from character sheets, you are walking around and kind of physically embodying your character, to the extent where, some LARP games even have sort of real fight scenes with fake weapons where you're trying to kind of bash your opponents over the head. But the Nordic countries have this really fascinating kind of movement where they are taking this idea of live action roleplay and they're applying it to some really interesting and often kind of quite serious and quite, quite dark situations. There's, for example, there have been games set in gay communities at the time of the AIDS epidemic. There have been games exploring kind of life inside a cult and the sort of mental manipulation that goes on there. And it just fascinates me kind of how people try to capture these situations and these scenarios and really what people are trying to say about them in these games and why they think that games are a good way to explore such really kind of heavy themes that have such kind of emotional resonance for a lot of people. And yeah, I would love to do a kind of long read, kind of deep dive into that, but that's quite a weird one to try to pitch to editors. So I don't know. Let me get this book out of the way. Let me at least get all the copies out to the backers in the States, and then I'll have a think about who I might pitch it to.
So your last game then is a game I bought from Drive-Thru RPG and have yet to play, and then a second edition came out, so I guess I'll never play my version. But this is Monsterhearts. And you said in your bio that Vampire helped you as a closeted bi guy to explore your sexuality, and you use the word subtly. How was it growing up as a bisexual person in the community that you grew up in?
Yeah, well, the sort of historical context there is that at the time in the UK, there was a campaign to overturn some really nasty legislation, which basically forbade schools from discussing, same-sex relationships in anything but the most kind of negative terms.
We should never forget that Margaret Thatcher was a terrible, terrible homophobic cow.
I've always managed to not forget that various conservative governments have not been entirely supportive of the LGBT community, it's fair to say. But so this legislation was in the process of being overturned, but at the time there was this really acrimonious, really horrible debate which was just nakedly homophobic in ways that you couldn't really imagine in British media nowadays. So everywhere you looked, there were newspaper headlines, railing against the idea that children could be exposed to, the gay agenda, the gay lifestyle, the kind of homosexual menace. And as someone who was growing up attracted to, guys as well as girls, it was really quite psychologically damaging for a lot of people, I think. But in RPGs, and particularly in Vampire, I think, the supernatural has always been used as a metaphor for any number of things, including sexuality. But where you have this game that is about, the nature of it is that you're going to have a degree of kind of physical contact, and you're going to have a degree of, seduction and kind of, just the kind of interactions that I couldn't have in real life because I was just terrified of anyone, finding out that was bi. And I think the result was that I played characters and kind of played around with some of those ideas and some of those identities in ways that were kind of so subtle that I don't think the other players at the table would have picked up on them. But it was certainly a kind of big outlet for me and a big way of sort of exploring kind of who I was and who I was attracted to and what that meant in the context of my life.
And I think we're of a similar age, and I think we probably come from a sort of similar background. And I grew up. I grew up in a rural area in which it was kind of unthinkable to be gay, and homophobia, casual homophobia, was the part of every conversation that you'd have. I mean, how difficult was it for you to come out, and how difficult was it for you to come out to yourself, to acknowledge that this is a part of me? Was that almost as hard as telling your family and your friends?
Yeah, well, at the time, I mean, I didn't. I was almost 30 by the time that I kind of told my family and friends. I told my wife quite a bit sooner than that, but it really leaves a lasting impression with people. If you go to school every day, and as you say, just about every conversation has these kind of homophobic jokes, or if you, I mean, there were billboard campaigns in Scotland. There was a particularly nasty campaign called Keep the Clause, which was largely bankrolled by a kind of transport tycoon that owned a bus franchise and train services and things. But it was this really kind of well-resourced, well-funded, really kind of politically and ideologically driven campaign. And I mean, the other thing is, I mean, you talk to people who worked in kind of LGBT support organisations at the time, and they'll tell you there was, there were spikes in suicides at the time of this campaign. I mean, it got really dark in ways that just seem unthinkable. Looking at it from a 2019 perspective, it's more akin to what you might expect to find in, Putin's Russia than in, in the UK. But I think that one of the things that doesn't get enough credit for kind of evolving the debate and kind of moving us on is the kind of role of media. And I don't just mean news media in that. I mean things like, TV shows. I mean, light entertainment, things like even kind of, it's far from my cup of tea, but things like Glee, taking these LGBT characters and putting them in front of massive audiences and saying, these are valid people. These are, human beings with as much right to their relationships and their orientation as anyone else. It's been fantastic to see that kind of process and that evolution, and I can only hope that it continues, and that for kids who are growing up, asking questions about their orientation, that they don't have the same level of pressure or negativity that the previous generation, that my generation had.
And you said in your bio that you wish you'd had Monsterhearts around when you were going through that phase of discovery. In what ways does Monsterheart approach these topics?
It's right. So Avery Alder is the designer. She is a queer trans woman from Canada, and she has just encapsulated so many kind of clever, important ideas in this game. But the one that I keep coming back to is when I explain Monsterhearts, particularly to straight people, one of the key concepts is that you're not in control of your character's orientation. So if someone rolls, to establish an attraction with your character, and the dice say that you're attracted to them, then that's it, and you've got to go along with it for the purposes of the game. And a lot of people say, well, that's really taking kind of control out of my hands, and it's putting me into this situation where people are going to be making judgments and interacting with my character in different ways, and it's something that I've got no control over. And at that point, every LGBT person in the world just points up their, puts their hand up and says hi, because that's exactly the kind of real life experience of LGBT people everywhere, being judged and considered, in the terms of the game, monstrous for something that is a part of your personality and a part of your character that you have no control over, is just a brilliant representation of that in the form of a game. And I mean, there's so much other clever stuff in there. There's the way it builds up this kind of web of kind of manipulation and attraction and kind of friendship and enmity between the characters. I mean, I could talk all night about the cool stuff that has happened in Monsterhearts games, but I suspect you probably don't have the time for it.
And so in your notes, you called it a powerful piece of work. Do you think for people who wish to be gaming aficionados, who wish to know the full breadth of what gaming could be, that this is required reading?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, I gave a lecture a couple of months ago at the Glasgow School of Art to their game design students, looking at some of the different narrative approaches that people have taken in games. And, this was one game that really went over pretty strongly with the students there. I think that, it's possible to make games which are not remotely controversial, that don't express big themes and big ideas. But ultimately, I think if we come back to what you were saying before, I consider games and game design to be an art form. And what is the purpose of an art form if it doesn't try to express important things? And Monsterhearts not only tries to, but just succeeds on so many levels. And I think that, whether or not you are, whether you're gay, straight, bi, questioning whether you are kind of interested in these topics or not, I think that it's just, if you have any, aspirations towards being kind of informed about what it's possible to express through games, then Monsterhearts is just an absolute must-read, yeah.
So one question then. You're driving out of Glasgow towards your cabin. I was going to try and make a Scottish geographical reference then, and I realised I've absolutely no idea. But you're heading out of the city, you're going down the road, you go around a corner, the back door flies open. 4 of your games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a brook, and are swept away forever. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Oh, man. It's a tough one. I think in terms of the sheer fun that I've had with it, I would have to say Fiasco. I've just had, when you get the right group of players together in the right spirit, and possibly after a beer or two, it's just an absolute recipe for just hilarity, and it's just wonderful. But by the same token, purely from a practical standpoint, you could, if pressed, use the box for TI4 as a makeshift shelter.
So which one are you going for?
I'm going to have to say Fiasco. I think it's got to be Fiasco.
So if people want to get hold of you, see what you're doing, follow your work, how would they go about that?
Yeah, the best place to get me is Twitter, where I am Owen_Duffy for my personal account, or at BoardGameBook for anything to do with the book. But yeah, I'm looking at starting a YouTube channel to support the book, so keep an eye out for that soon. And if you happen to see me at a convention, come up and say hi, because I'm generally pretty friendly. I don't bite.
Well, Owen Duffy, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. And if I haven't had to escape the Triffids with low self-esteem and the endless Eton old boys, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.